Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to talk, and thank you for coming. So this is a talk about carrying out a corpus-assisted discourse analysis on a corpus which contains both text and images. Now, traditionally, this has been very difficult to do, and the research I describe is very recent. It only involves quite a small corpus of about 100,000 words. So it was more of a kind of pilot study to see whether or not this approach would actually be feasible to do, and I'm currently doing it on a much bigger corpus, but this is the original study I did. So corpus-assisted discourse studies focuses on analysis of corpora to identify non-obvious meaning. And many studies in CADS have used corpora of newspapers texts, but the criticism of these studies is that they throw away the images of the photographs and they just look at the text, the words themselves. But writing and images work together to create meaning. So, for example, studies which have looked at representations of obesity in the news have found that the stigmatizing messages appear both in the written text, but also in the images as well. So there may be an image, say, like this one here, of somebody who's sort of big and they've got their head chopped off. Without their head or face showing, or they may be showing eating unhealthy foods. They are not often showing, say, in work context, for example, or in leisure or enjoying sport. So these images can reinforce or perhaps even contradict the messages in the written text. And corpus-based approaches to text containing images have tended to be quite small scale on the whole. They've sometimes resulted in separate manual qualitative analysis of the images, which worked alongside the more traditional corpus analysis of written text. Sometimes analysis are done separately, and then the findings are kind of considered together. And that's more like maybe a mixed methods analysis than a true multimodal analysis. And it can be very difficult to incorporate analysis of images into a corpus tool. And even for a multimodal analysis, what often happens is the image analysis bit tends to get done in a more qualitative manner. So a study by Mark McGlashan, he was one of my PhD students, so I know the study quite well. And he used a concept called collustration, where it's a sort of a blend of the words collocation and illustration. And he looked at the images in a corpus of children's picture books. And he found that a frequent phrase in this corpus was love each other. And this tended to occur next to pictures of family members who were kind of hugging in some way. And he said that the images helped to give meaning to that phrase, love each other, that love each other kind of because of the pictures showing people hugging, that's telling us that love involves physical closeness and touch. And you wouldn't get that if you were just looking at the words themselves. Now, Chris and Van Leuven have noted difficulties in using a coding system for images. They say images are too polysemous. A visual meaning is a floating chain of signifieds. And they note other issues as well, the fact that there's no agreed upon coding system. The task of looking at images and coding them can be very labor intensive. And images can have both a denotative and connotative meaning. So the approach I take in this study, to an extent, resolves some of these issues. It offers an automatic tagging system, which is fast, reasonably accurate if you tweak it a bit. And I wanted to use this system to see whether or not it was feasible to create and then analyze a multimodal corpus. So to describe the corpus, it consists of articles about the topic of obesity, which were collected from an online database called LexisNexis. And the articles had to contain either the words obese or obesity. They were all taken from a single month in September 2022. And I looked at 8 different British newspapers, which are just listed here. And I've got the number of articles, number of words per newspaper, and number of images I collected as well. So as you can see, this isn't a huge corpus, only 100,000 words. It's just 1 month of data. It took me about 2 weeks to collect all of this, including collecting the images as well. And we have 358 images. I should note also that I did this research with my colleague, Luke Collins, who also wrote the book with me that Eric mentioned, the anxiety book. Now, Lexis only contains the written text from the news articles. So to get the images, we had to go back to the websites of the newspapers and locate the original articles and then save the images from there. It was quite a fussy process. 2 newspapers were behind firewalls, the Times and Telegraph, So we weren't actually able to get all of the images. We could sometimes get the first one, but not the full image set of images for those. So we did get complete images for 121 articles. We got the first image for just 15, and some articles just didn't have any images at all, just 12 of those. So we saved these as separate JPEG files. For example, this is an example of what we called one of the files. You can see there's the date, there's the name of the newspaper, and then there's a number of the article, but which occurs in the original file. And we then use those as placeholders within the actual text of the corpus as well, to say where the image should go. So how did we tag the images? Not working. Now it's working. Okay, so we used an automatic system called Google Cloud Vision. This has since changed its name to something else. I apologize for that being a bit out of date now, but that's what it was called when we used it. You have to sign up for an account, and the system has a trial version where it will tag one image at a time. But you can also run a batch script on it to tag multiple images. It will tag the first 1,000 images for free, which is quite nice. After that, it costs $1.50 US to tag each set of 1,000 images after that. So with each image, you get a series of tags which are grouped into different categories. So here's how it works. Well, this is the kinds of things it shows. So it gives categories, the tags in different categories. So it will tag faces and emotions, for example. Here's a sample image, and it's saying what's the likelihood of these emotions being shown in this image. Most of these are very unlikely, but and it's kind of also said headwear is unlikely, even though there actually is headwear there. It will also tag objects. Now it's doing quite a bit better here. It's saying there's a person and they're wearing a hat. I wouldn't necessarily say it's a hat, but it's kind of close enough. And those numbers are percentage confidence. So it's saying it's 85% confident that this is a person. It will also tag labels in a much more general and specific way as well. So these are more kind of conceptual tags, things like travel or fashion design, as well as more specific labels like sleeve. And again, we've got the percentage confidence. And it also decides the dominant colors of the image as well. And then the last set of tags are to do with whether this image contains questionable content in some way. So is this an adult image? Does it contain violence? Is it racy in some way, et cetera, et cetera? So for our corpus, the most productive tag was the one on the top row here, the label tag. And our corpus resulted in 10,250 labels associated with it. Some images only got 4 labels, some got 50. So quite a range there. But we decided we would just focus our analysis around that top row. So here's an example of one of our text in our corpus. This is from the Daily Mail. And you can see there's some text underneath. There's an image of a family eating a meal. So we put this image into Google Cloud Vision. And these are the tags that it came up with, along with those percentage confidence scores as well. And you can see it cuts off at 50%. That's kind of the default. So a lot of tags here. I think it did quite well. I mean, it even got the watch, 98%. The man's wearing a watch. You can see it right in the foreground at the bottom there. I thought was quite impressed with the fact he did that. It didn't do perfect. And I've kind of put in bold here the ones that I felt were maybe probably wrong in some ways. So this is probably not a picture frame. It's a television in the background. This is not a restaurant. It's clearly someone's house. So, some of these are wrong. I wasn't sure that, they've tagged it breakfast, lunch, and brunch. It can't be all 3. So I'm guessing it's probably lunch, possibly brunch. So I'm saying breakfast is probably wrong, and so on. So it's done okay, I think. Even the least confident tagged t-shirt is 50%. So then we need to transfer these tags into our text files. So here's an example of what one of our corpus files at the start of it would look like. We've got a placeholder here for the image, and then I swap this out and put the tags in, which is rather messy. This is a very simplistic way of doing tagging, I have to confess. I've just put the tags in diamond brackets, and I've prefaced each one with the word label, so that can help us to tell us that this is a label tag and not the word. Sometimes when I'm going to be doing the analysis, I want to remove the angle brackets. So I want the word watch to be different from the label watch. So if I have the word watch and then I've got label watch, the Corpus tool will know the difference between the two and not get them mixed up. I've also put a full stop quite strangely after the set of tags, and that's really to help me to identify collocates accurately. Sometimes I've got several images, one after another, and I want to look at the collocates of a tag. So I want to say, if say an image has a tag like meal, what other tags will go around it? What other tags also occur in that image? What are the collocates? But if I've got several tags, several images all together, it will sort of maybe bleed over into the next image. So the full stop says almost like that's a sentence. And I can tell my tagger, my Corpus tool, to ignore things that only occur within sentences in a way. Since we've done this, we've created a more complex version of the tagging system using full XML, and we're using that with Lancsbox for this system where you're working with WordSmith, which we found a bit easier to do to begin with. So let's move to the analysis. Well, there are several ways we can look at this corpus. We can do a traditional corpus-based analysis, just looking at the words. So we could say, what are the keywords in each newspaper, for example? And I'll show you that in a minute. We can also say, are certain newspapers likely to have certain types of images that contain certain tags? So what image tags would be key for each newspaper? Or if we have a certain tag of an image, are there other tags that would be associated with that image as well? And then finally, what keywords would be associated with different image tags? So if an article contains, say, an image that's been tagged as smile, what kinds of words are also going to appear in that article? So we can get keywords by comparing two subcorpora together. One would contain all of the words which are from text that have an image that is smile, and then another, the sort of reference corpus would be everything else that doesn't have smile in it. We could compare those together to get the keywords. It's a lot to do and maybe a bit confusing at this point. So what I'll do, I'll kind of go through some of my results and show you what this actually looks like. So let's just look at the words. We'll forget the images. What does this tell us if we just look at the words? So this is a traditional corpus analysis, and in comparing the 8 newspapers, getting the keywords from each one. So for example, to get the male keywords, I used a reference corpus consisting of all of the other 7 newspapers together. And I call this the remainder method of doing keywords. So I went through each time and did it for each newspaper. And you can see we've got positive keywords. WordSmith also gives you negative keywords, words which occur less frequently in that newspaper compared to everything else. So for example, the word I is a positive keyword for the Times. The Times seems to have articles where people are using the word I a lot, maybe first-person narratives. But the Independent and the Telegraph have I as a negative keyword. They don't tend to have articles which contain the word I very much. Lots of keywords here. I'm not going to talk about all of them, obviously. I'll just focus on maybe 3 newspapers, the Express, the Star, and the Independent. And I'll give you a couple of examples of keywords from each. So here's the Express, and we found a lot of the keywords were relating to weight reduction, words like decrease and help. There were keywords relating to specific foods or supplements to help you to lose weight. The Express therefore tended to give stories which were advice on nutrition, helping people to lose weight. So we'd say this is a biomedical frame around obesity. Science has been used to help to kind of explain obesity and tell people what to do. But it's also maybe a personal responsibility frame as well. So it's kind of saying, well, we're going to give you the information. These are the foods and supplements, but it's up to you then to go and take those. So it's up to the individual to make those choices. The Star had a number of keywords relating to women and girls, lots of kind of female keywords, female pronouns and female names. And this related to social media influencers, particularly women. So we've got words like Instagram, followers, an influencer, which are keywords too. And then words relating to body positivity, words like positive, but also haters and trolls. So the Star tends to have articles which use a body positivity frame. It's focusing on young women who are proud of their weight and are very well known on the internet, but they're described as getting a mixture of positive and negative attention. And then the Independent has keywords which frames obesity in terms of society's laws and structures. So keywords here relate to government policy, things like government policies, ban, restrictions. So here obesity is not so much a matter of an individual choice, but a matter of something that the government is shaping and fixing. So we've seen the newspapers have very different ways of talking about obesity, and that's a traditional text-based analysis, which does show us something interesting, and we could stop there. And I think normally in the past I've had to stop there, and that's kind of been okay. But it's interesting to see what the images give us extra, if anything. So I ran the process again of keywords, but this time just looking at the tags rather than the words. So here we have the tags, which are key. And I've taken away the word label just because it looks a bit messier. So you can just see what the tags are here. They're in those diamond brackets. You can see that some newspapers didn't have any image tags. They didn't really have a lot of images, so they didn't get image tags, but quite a few did. So again, I'll focus on some of these and kind of try to explain what they're showing. So here's the Daily Mail, and its key tags were rectangle, slope, and map, and some others. And when we looked at the images that were tagged as rectangle, slope, and map, we found that they tended to be infographics or diagrams or charts which give information in image form. So we've got the bar chart here with projections of rates of obesity in the UK, and the bars are the reasons why this gets tagged as rectangle. It's those shapes. Second one is a graphic of America showing rates of obesity, and that's why we get the map tag coming up so much. So the Mail uses many more of these kind of informational images compared to other newspapers. Again, a biomedical frame of obesity where they're using scientific research and data in order to write about obesity, and that helps to maybe legitimate the article as well, the kind of claims within it. The Express has key image tags, though, relating to food more. And when we looked at some of the images, we can see why that's the case. So here's a typical Express image. It's a picture showing the kinds of food that have high cholesterol in, and it's saying you should sort of try to eat less of these kinds of food instead. So similar to the Mail, it's also an infographic, but again, it's kind of more of a personal responsibility kind of image here. So it's telling you what you should and shouldn't do. The Mail was just kind of giving information. This is kind of giving direction or instruction. Here are some image tags from the Star that were key. Now, these tend to relate to women's bodies and women's undergarments and clothing. We saw earlier that the Star talks about female influencers online and body positivity. And again, the image tags kind of confirm this focus, but they kind of go a bit further, and they show us that these articles are often showing pictures of women wearing sportswear or underwear, smiling, taking selfies maybe. Quite revealing, I think, of their body parts as well. Slightly exploitative, I felt sometimes, and I wondered who the target audience of these kind of articles were. It's not something I maybe would have got so much from if I just looked at the words, but having the images really helped me to understand what these articles were about and what they were trying to do, what their kind of agenda was maybe. And then finally, The Guardian had one key tag, which was shelf. And when we looked at this, it was always pictures of supermarkets, food on supermarkets. And it was articles about big businesses and shops and their relationship to obesity, often criticizing supermarkets for their policies. This is not something I would have picked upon if I just looked at the Guardian keywords. There were no words about supermarkets that came up as keywords in the Guardian. So this told me something that I didn't know, which was really interesting and useful. I would have missed it if I just looked at the words. Okay, so we've looked at the words, then we've looked at the images, and we've considered them separately. But I think a truly multimodal analysis considers them both images and words at the same time. So this slide is really only relevant if you want to do this yourself later, maybe, and you want to use WordSmith and kind of follow the method. Whichever corpus tool you use, you often have to go into the settings if you're looking at image tags and sort of fiddle with them to get what you want, otherwise it won't give you both. So I've gone into the advanced settings here, and I've told it, first of all, where it says markup to ignore, I kind of changed that. And then what I'm saying is, I only want to look at files which contain this particular label. So label event, for example, where I've put a circle in, and then I build a word list containing only the files that have an image that contains a certain label. And then I'll do the same thing, but it's cases where this does not occur. So it's where it says here, but not. Don't worry if that doesn't make any sense to you. It's only really, if you're reasonably familiar with WordSmith, that's going to make sense. But what I'm trying to do here is I'm looking at an image and I'm saying, what are the words that are associated with that image? What words occur in that file? if a text has a certain image associated with it or a certain tag. So here are the top most frequent image tags in the corpus. The first one is event. So 143 images in my corpus are tagged event. Sixth one, abdomen, 90 times that occurs. So then I've looked at the keywords which occur in files that have an image which is tagged as an event. And we've got things like I, me, and my, which are positive first person pronouns. The negative keywords, UK, sugar, and protein. Words which occur near an image, which contains event. These are the collocates. Await according body research and said. And if an image contains the event tag, it's also likely to contain the tags fun, gesture, formal wear, font, and electric blue. So you can see we've got a kind of a fully multimodal analysis in this table where we're looking at the relationship between the words and the images. So I'll take just a couple of tags from this table and sort of try to illustrate how this works in a full analysis. And I'll take the first one, event, and then I'll look at the last one, abdomen. So here's the event tag. Now, this was most likely to appear in the Mirror or the Times newspaper. And images tagged event tended to show people posing, often in quite smart clothing, like these two images here. That's why also we get the formal wear tag collocating with this image as well. So they're quite well-groomed people and kind of formally posed photographs. They offer quite a positive or maybe aspirational representation of the people who were described as having obesity, quite different from the earlier research that I mentioned, which often shows people with obesity in quite ill-fitting clothes. And we've got these first-person pronoun keywords, I, me, and my occurring with these images. And you can kind of see these texts have quite a lot of first-person narratives where somebody is talking about their own relationship with obesity, maybe their struggle with it, their experiences relating to body weight. And these are very humanizing, quite positive articles, I think. They place the protagonist in quite a positive light. They describe how losing weight is quite difficult. But also, these articles also kind of often uncritically say losing weight is something that's worth doing, which we would maybe say, maybe that's not something that everyone would agree with. So we'd say there's maybe a kind of brave struggle discourse around these articles. Now here's the abdomen tag, and this was more common in the Daily Mirror and this Star as well. So these are images that contain tags like waist, chest, thigh, undergarment, and human leg, as well as abdomen. We're often finding these very body positivity articles, again, which I've mentioned already. Pictures of young women often wearing quite tight or revealing clothing or swimwear in some way. I've actually blurred out the images here. I didn't really feel comfortable showing you a picture of a woman in swimwear in front of an audience, so I've kind of blurred that out. But you get the idea of what the image is about. There are texts that contain words like followers, body, and love, again relating to social media influencers. And again, this is a body positivity frame. The articles are about learning to love yourself, to love your body. Provide people with a narrative about accepting yourself. They don't tend to contain the word food, these articles. So they're not about the relationship between diet and obesity, but more about the people themselves and how they feel about their bodies and how much they love themselves. So we can kind of get a better sense, I think, of analyzing these images and how they relate to the text in the article and how that results in creating a kind of meaning and understanding of the full article. It's quite important then to know that somebody is pictured wearing a suit or a bikini, I think, in an article, if you're going to be analyzing the article itself. So to reflect on the approach, I should note again, this was a very small scale study, only 100,000 words, 149 articles. We did conclude, though, that it was worth doing, that including these image tags gave us a complete and more sophisticated analysis, and it was fairly fast to get the tagging done. Wasn't straightforward, though, I have to admit. We had to learn how to use the Google Cloud Vision interface. I think if you've got some kind of coding skills, it's a lot easier to use that system. And it was quite time-consuming to find the images manually in the websites of the articles and then save them and label them and that sort of thing, and then put them into the image files. That took 2 weeks. And since then, for the bigger project I'm doing now, we've employed someone who actually knows more about coding than I do, and they've done that kind of more automatically, writing scripts to do it. So it's been a lot faster to do. It's still taken several weeks to write the codes, but we've been able to collect hundreds more images, and we have a corpus now of about 1.5 million words of articles. In terms of the image tagging itself, we'd note that the coding scheme was a bit mysterious. We weren't sure why certain code tags were associated with certain images, why some images got lots of tags, some only got 4 tags. Some tags were very specific, some are quite general. We didn't really know what was going on there. There were no tags for identities like woman or man or Muslim, for example, which we thought was quite interesting. We suspect maybe that they do exist, but maybe people would get quite angry if they had an image of themselves and it was tagged maybe incorrectly, and then there'd be kind of pushback and complaints. So maybe they've taken certain kind of controversial tags away from that. We also have experiments with techniques to improve accuracy closer to 100%. You saw there were some mistakes in that example I showed earlier. So for our second larger project, we changed the 50% confidence to 70%. We also looked at the most frequent tags, and we looked at how accurate they were, and then we removed some of those because they were getting wrong most of the time. And that's increased our overall accuracy to about 90% now, I'd say, which is still not perfect, but I think it's good enough to work with this system for now. We could also use the tagger to train it to maybe add new tags in, like celebrity, which would have been quite useful too. So this has helped us to provide better answers to our research questions, and that's what we want. But it also, I think, raises as many questions as it answers. It's a new and potentially exciting direction for corpus-assisted discourse analysis to take. And I've been working in this field for about 20 years, and I've been wanting to do this for about 20 years, and this is the first time I've had the chance to do it. So for me, it's really exciting to do. It gives a new dimension to my research and hopefully others, and it's exciting to see how this kind of tool might be used in the future, or tools like it. So the work here is described in the Baker and Collins paper in Applied Corpus Linguistics, which Eric is very much associated with, if you want to read it, and it's open access as well. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Lancaster and Northern Arizona.
Yeah.
We'll add Paula you here in the future.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. And the title of Professor McEnery's talk, as you can see here, is Swearing, Discourse, and Function in Conversational British English. Everybody knows Tony. We thank him from many, many years of work, new approaches, and all the MOOCs and teaching us Corpus Linguistics globally. I participated in many of them, encouraged my students to participate in many of them. The first time I saw Tony was one American Association for Corpus Linguistics conference in Brigham Young University a long time ago. And, you know, I was already a big fan of his work. And have been following what he was doing, and obviously with Paul as well, really influenced a lot of what I've done in corpus-based research. Tony is a distinguished professor of English, language and linguistics at Lancaster. He was interim chief executive, Economic and Social Science Research Council from 2017 to 2018, also chief accounting officer. I was thinking what you did as an accounting officer there, also for the Economic and Social Research Council at the same year. And obviously a lot of his work in corpus-based research. He was awarded a Queen's Anniversary Prize for this line of research in 2015. And many, many, many other things as well. We're so honored that Tony is also our departmental academic advisor. So we hope to learn a lot from Tony moving forward. So without further ado, here's Professor Tony McEnery.
Great, thank you. Just to let you know, a chief accounting officer is easy. If the numbers are wrong, the minister will sack you. That's what it means. Okay. Well, Paul talked about the worst 2 years of his life. I'm going to talk about the type of language that he might have used to express that more clearly. Okay, so as some of you will know, I've had quite a long-standing program of research looking at swearing in English. It's an interesting topic. It's one that isn't studied too much. But in this talk, I'm bringing it together with another strain of work I've been working on with the people at Northern Arizona University, of trying to think about building blocks in conversation, what we call discourse units. I'm bringing those two lines of work together here today. And that's why I've mentioned the other people who've worked with me on this. As I go on, this is actually a fragment of a much bigger piece of work. And if you see things you'd want to take a note of, don't bother, because at the end, I'll give you a reference to an open access paper with all of it in. So just enjoy listening and watching. Discourse is interesting. We've just heard one use of the word discourse from Paul, where we're talking about these ways of talking about things in language, etc. But I'm talking about maybe the more technical sense of it within linguistics, meaning above the level of the turn. We're looking at turns in conversation, but sometimes meaning and structure can exist above the level of the turn. And that's what we're interested in here. We can talk about discourse, macrostructure and microstructure. A lot of work in corpus linguistics, when it moves towards looking at pragmatics or conversation, will stay at the microstructural level. It will stay at the turn level or below. So if I said to you something like discourse markers, you'd all start to think of words which are discourse markers. Then they are microstructural features of discourse, often pointing at macrostructural features. But it's the macrostructural I'm interested in today. Things which bring a conversation together, make it coherent, but above the level of the turn. Now, there are different views on what those macrostructures are. So I might be able to sort of outline it to you simply, and you'd say, okay, I get that. But a bit like in the last talk, when we actually come to taxonomies and ontologies, there's a lot of disagreement. It's relatively ill-formed. So the way I tend to talk about it is if you think of microstructures like a brick, and macrostructures as things that you can build from bricks, you can think of how you can put bricks together in different configurations in order to construct different things. So I might build a garden wall, I might build a house, I might build a shed, I might build a prison. You can do all sorts of things with it, but at the microstructural level, they'd look kind of similar. But those macrostructures are different. For some researchers like Van Dijk, they're propositional. You're saying as you move through conversation, you move through different, if you like, propositional turns, and that's what's structuring the conversation. I'm talking about this, then I'm talking about this, then we're talking about this, etc. So it's sort of propositional. And for some like Schifrin, it's more functional. We're performing this function in conversation, perhaps an introduction or an initial discussion. Then we're performing this function in conversation. I want to find things out from you. Then we're forming this function in conversation. So you can take slightly different views about actually what macrostructures may be and what they may achieve. And then on other occasions, you see very good linguists quite reasonably pointing to more sort of inventories of structures. So Crystal talks about a view of discourse as a coherent unit, such as a sermon, an argument, a joke, or a narrative. And certainly on that level, we can say, oh yeah, I guess they're all examples of macrostructures. I can think of how to build them. They come in a sort of relatively coherent block, and I know what I'm doing when I'm producing one. And indeed, that's quite similar to Hymes's idea of the speech event. But if you like, the ontology isn't complete. Just being able to point at a single example and say, I'm talking about that type of thing, doesn't give you a way of actually approaching corpus data and then categorizing the conversation into all of the structures that exist within it. It's a start. We know we can name a few, but we can't actually name them all. So the approach that we took, and here I think actually to be fair, the initial work was done by Paul working with Jesse, and then I worked more closely with Jesse, and Doug came in as well. And between us, we worked for a couple of years, 2 or 3 years, just looking at conversations in the Spoken BNC 2014, asking ourselves 2 questions. One, can we actually build up chunks? Can we actually agree on where the chunks are in the conversations? And secondly, can we agree on what functions we think those chunks have? So we went through a process, first of all, of trying to determine how we can see the chunks in conversation, and then a process of trying to assign functional labels that we could all agree to those chunks. Now, this talk won't explore Crystal's view, that inventory view, but the associated paper does focus on that, and I'll reference that again at the end. And the 2 views are not dissociated, but more on that later. So I've said that we built this inventory of macro structures that we're working with. What do they look like? Well, we call them discourse units. We've discovered that generally in terms of their length, there's something like about 10 turns, something like that. They can vary in length, but we think that they have a size around that. And we think they have a range of functions. But before I talk to you about those functions, you're probably sitting there thinking, this sounds quite dry and quite structural. He's talking about macro structures, etc. How does he smuggle in swearing? Was this just a random thought in his head? No, it wasn't. Very often the case, actually, is that when you look at research in swearing, there's actually quite a lot of acknowledgement that context, and actually conversational context, is important to the use of bad language. So a lot of studies of swearing look at contextual features. They're typically sociolinguistic, but sometimes they do look at contexts of discourse. So, for example, Koch and Osterreicher argue that discourse is responsive to the conditions under which it's produced and understood. And that must actually relate to macrostructures. And indeed, when we look at research on swearing, although there's no research on swearing until now, which has said, how does swearing relate to these macrostructures? A bit like the crystal example, you can find individual studies which say swearing works rather differently in this type of macrostructure. So, for example, there's quite a lot of work looking at swearing in jokes. People seem to think that there's some type of strong relationship between jokes and swearing. Also, Beers Fagerstein looked at comic strips or conflict in speech. People might talk about swearing without thinking about how this might talk about how swearing relates more generally to discourse macrostructures. So the idea was that given that the literature on swearing seems to be continually hinting and suggesting that discourse macrostructure is important, and that we now maybe have a set of labels to describe discourse macrostructure, could you bring the two together, see how the two interact, and then reflect back perhaps on some of the ideas people have had about how discourse macrostructure and swearing might interact? Of course, I'd always say to do that, you need the right corpus and the right annotation. We're fortunate in that we have the BNC 2014, a corpus of conversational English gathered within social settings in the home between people who knew one another, who were talking in an unguarded way. The corpus has plenty of swearing in it. So we have that nice corpus of data to work with. And the right annotation, the work we've been doing on discourse units. As I've said, I think to some extent it's a descriptive black hole in our understanding of interaction, what exists between the turn and the large functional unit presentation. I'm doing a presentation now. That is a very big macro structure, but between that and the individual utterances I'm producing, I'm actually clumping up my utterances in different ways. And it's at that level that we're really interested in, that lowest level of macro structure. So narrative, for example, we might say is another large macro structure, but we think it's built from intermediate units, lower level atomic discourse units, which are the lowest level of macro structural organization. And we, of course, are hypothesizing that they're functionally meaningful. So we want to combine microstructural analyses, individual swear words, and see how they interact with these macrostructures. Is it the case that macrostructures and microstructures like that interact? As I've said, I've been collaborating with Dirk and Jesse and others on that, and we want to see what lies between the long conversation or the narrative or the presentation and the turn, those brick-like macrostructural units. What do they do? As I said, we annotated the BNC 2014. We initially annotated about 5 million words with our annotation scheme. It was very difficult. Let me reassure you of that. We started this work in about 2017, and I'm talking to you about it now. The first couple of years was working out how to do chunking and what the functional labels would be. We then worked from 2019 through to about 2020 2021 in doing the first draft of the annotations. Those annotations, of course, had some dual coding on them so that we could check the consistency of the annotation. And then we passed it through to the NAU team for further checking. At that stage, about a third of the annotations were rejected, and we went back and did them again. So it was very painstaking work. But if you want to read about the spoken BNC, the data that it's based on, you can look at that article. So again, all these articles I'm citing today are open access. But I think it's useful and it establishes something of a benchmark for everyday conversational competence, at least in these intimate settings in the home, which is what the BNC 2014 is about. Now, I've talked to you already about the basic atomic units of macrostructure that we hypothesize and that we say exist and which we have annotated in the data. And these are them. Some came, some went as we were evolving this system, but this is the system as it stands. Now, these codes, we apply these to our discourse units in a range of ways. Most importantly, we say that each discourse unit has a primary function. It's mainly about this. It may have a secondary function, and on occasion it can have a tertiary function. So, for example, let me look at the first one, situation-dependent commentary. That's where you're talking about something in the here and now. So I could be saying, I'm here today in this lecture theatre. It's a nice lecture theatre. What's it like, Tony? You'd say to me, well, it's quite large, it's raked, but that's a sort of situation-dependent commentary. I'm talking about the here and now. But in the middle of that, I might smuggle in a joke. I might say, and it's cold and like the rest of Hong Kong or something like that. I can smuggle in a joke. So I might say it's mainly situation-dependent commentary with a side serving, a sort of tertiary function of joke. So we can get that in. But actually, we tend to find that when we look at the discourse units, it's really the primary function that we've assigned to them that drives our analyses. And that's what I'll be looking at today. So situation-dependent commentary, joking around, I think that's pretty self-evident. Engaging in conflict, interestingly, very rare in data, as you'd quite imagine, certainly in the types of settings that we were looking at. People were recording conversations in the home and talking to friends. Actually, if you're getting a lot of conflict data off that, they're not going to be friends and living in the same home for very much longer. So actually, that tends to be a relatively rare tag in our data. Figuring things out. We saw some of that before when Paul was asking somebody how he could advance his slide, and they engaged in this little figuring things out interchange. Sharing feelings and opinions, what Paul did at the end of his talk, and we'll see some words he could have used later on. Advice, giving advice and instructions. You know, Eric and I had a conversation about how to get onto campus. That's an advice and instructions thing. Describing or explaining the past. So earlier this week, type of thing. Future, describing the future. Time neutral description. And then every now and again, you get non-discourse units, which look interesting, but actually usually when you look at them, they're usually about negotiating who's going next, or who's giving up the floor and who's taking it. And usually they're composed of sort of fillers, etc. So you might finish something and then you'll see sequences going, yeah, right, okay then, well. And they're easy to ignore in analysis, but of course, in pragmatic terms and in terms of conversation management, they're doing incredibly important work. I'm saying, do you want to go? And they're saying, no, thank you. And I'm saying, well, maybe you do. Okay, then I'll say something and then carry on. So those are the labels that we assign to the data. The coding process, you know, it's really straightforward. The type of thing that you'd expect, very similar to what Paul was talking about before. And it's all done in that way. I won't talk through it because it's been talked about already, but really it's about going in there, reading the data, putting in the tags, checking it, and then later on, of course, we do checking of one another's work as well with a sample of that to see that we're being consistent. To show you what the files look like afterwards, you see this type of thing, see if this can work. No, it doesn't. At the top of the screen, you can see the opening bracket DU. This is the start of a discourse unit. Its SDC equals 3. It's primarily situation-dependent commentary. Look at the photo. Look, it's moving. Oh, just don't think it can fly. Little thing. Fly, little one, fly. There's something about feelings in there as well. And then we move into a second one where it's mainly about the past with some element of feeling in it, and then it concludes. So we're breaking things into what we think are functionally coherent units and applying these codes to them with a primary code, and then sometimes a secondary code, Mark II, and sometimes a tertiary code, Mark III. But the key is the primary code. That really is what's driving the choices in the discourse along. We separate them. We add the opening tag, we add the functions, and we add the closing tag. That's how the analysis goes. Okay, so that gives you a brief idea of how we do the discourse unit analysis. When it comes to swearing, a very vexed question is, what words will we look for? It's very easy to sort of casually say we're looking at swearing, but what constitutes swearing can be contested, and what constitutes a swear word can be contested, even within one culture. So very often you see a lengthy and sometimes sterile debate in the swearing literature about what constitutes swear words. So for this piece of research, we stuck to what we think are canonical swear words which I think everybody would agree are swear words, and we avoided the marginal examples where it could be difficult. In doing that, we were following Love and his work on the BNC 2014, looking at swear words, and he described them as 16 pure swear words. I quite like the idea of purity in swear words. And I've given you an idea there of the lemmas that we looked for. Of course, we're looking for all forms of those words in our analysis, but counting them together. So we simply, in this case, as often happens in research, blame somebody else for our decision. We'll follow Love, we said. We'll do what he did. So if you don't like it, talk to him. But no, actually, he made perfectly good decisions. And I think most speakers of British English would accept that these are swear words. Yeah. So what happens? What do we get when we apply our scheme to our data? Well, in terms of the different primary functions of the discourse units that we look at, this is how the data works out. Our data breaks down into just over 10,000 discourse units that we're looking at here. The most frequent discourse unit is time-neutral description. People are mainly, or at least the rank order is that they're, first of all, describing things. Secondly, past-oriented description, they're describing things in the past. But then in terms of social interaction, you see some of the other discourse units come to the fore. Figuring things out is number 3 in the list. And of course, giving personal feelings and evaluation is another important macro structure that people call upon. Then there's something of a gap, and you get down to situation-dependent commentary, something of a gap in frequency terms, and you get future-oriented description and joking around. And then again, you get another sort of discontinuity, and you get down to the less frequent ones, giving advice and conflict. In terms of pragmatics, I'd actually say that both of those, one perhaps less obviously than the other, are face-threatening acts. If I'm engaging in conflict, I think we can all agree that's going to be a face-threatening act. Eric, why didn't you tell me I could have come up those stairs? It would have taken me half. It's not very nice. But similarly, Eric mansplaining to me how to get into the building isn't very nice. They're both face-threatening acts in a way. And that actually probably in itself just explains why in the type of conversational setting we were looking at, these are relatively rare. You can imagine different discourse settings where these would have been much higher. So if we'd done it, say, for example, in some type of store where they fix your computer or you go to ask questions, you would have imagined that giving advice thing being much higher up because the context is warranted for getting the advice, so the face-threatening act is lower. Similarly, if I was in a court of law, you might expect the conflict tag to go well up the ranking because it's a context within which conflict is expected. It's still a face-threatening act, but it's expected. So we have to remember that the choice of these macro structures, as we're seeing them here, isn't across the whole of language. It's in the specific social context in which we've gathered the data. And that specific social context militates in favor of some discourse units being drawn upon rather than the other, which is an initial test, actually, of how useful this is. We can explain the results. They're entirely plausible given the context that we looked at. Okay, but this is what you actually wanted to see. Can I see whether these microstructural choices, which also impact on, say, interactional pragmatics, face-threatening acts, etc., the use of swear words, can we say that they intersect in any way with the macrostructures that we've identified in our data? Yes. However, the first thing to say is that swearing occurs relatively infrequently in this data set. In fact, it probably occurs relatively infrequently in almost all spoken data sets. It's no less frequent in the BNC 2014 than it was in the BNC 1994. Some of the patterns of usage have shifted, but it's still something which occurs in language. But it doesn't occur that often in spoken conversation for reasons we might explore in a moment. But it's there, and we can count it, and there are enough examples to say something about it. At most, a single type of macrostructures includes something like 18.4 swear words per 10,000 words, and that's once in every 8 joke discourse units. So just jokes do draw upon swearing, as we'll see on the screen there. And the one that seems to shun it the most is advice. And again, you can just see it there by the size of the bar. Ignore the numbers. Just look at the size of the bar. These stacked bar charts are showing you where it's frequent and where it's not. And other studies have also shown that swear words occur somewhat rarely. J, love. So what's interesting here is how, in fact, sometimes it doesn't occur rarely. If the proposition was that macrostructure has no impact upon the selection of swear words, or vice versa, what we'd see would be a relatively flat graph. The bar charts would be the same size, but we're not seeing that. These stack bars would be the same size. We're not seeing that. What we're seeing is that I'd say notably feelings and jokes and perhaps situated dependent commentaries have a greater propensity to draw upon these words than, say, advice, where it's very few. Not only is it infrequent with advice, but very few words are drawn upon as well. Also, you'd expect that as a side effect of the frequency, but only 2 words are shown there. Just look at the colors, number of words. So advice seems to be positively shunning it. Jokes, well, we have quite a range of swear words used, and they're used relatively frequently by comparison to advice. So that image there is already telling me that I have an argument in favor of some interaction between the micro and the macro level in terms of selection, and I would argue function. But we need to think function through. We'll do that on the next slide. But look at these 3 words. I'm sorry, I'll have to say them. So if any of you are offended, I apologize in advance. Wank, cunt, and arse. If we look at wank, and I'll reference this screen because sometimes the colors on that screen aren't quite the same. You see that this occurs in feelings, and it also occurs in situated dependent commentary. So it seems to be drawn to these high frequency contexts, these contexts which seem to license the use of swear words. Similarly, the word cunt, which is the light blue one, well, that seems to occur in jokes. That's where we get quite a big blue bar, but actually there's a little bit in advice there also. But jokes seem to draw that strong word in. And then the word arse, which is the yellow one, well, that seems to be much more smoothly distributed. That seems to be a word which isn't particularly sensitive to function. It occurs in a range of functions. So we've seen some words here which seem to cluster into individual functions or pairs of functions, especially the high frequency ones, others which seem to be just evenly spread out across it. So there seems to be different patterns of attraction and interaction. Okay. What we'd say is that swear words occur more in discourse units, which we might reasonably believe are associated with emotion. So jokes, I'm trying to, believe it or not, when I tell one, get an emotional reaction from you, a sort of laughter. You think this is great. Or feelings, where I'm trying to convey my feelings to you. These are the two types of discourse unit where we see these words coming in. And these words, of course, are classically associated with strong emotion. Not necessarily a negative. Remember, the joke isn't a negative thing. I'm using a swear word in the context of a joke to elicit a positive thing. But perhaps when I'm conveying feelings, like Paul might have done before, describing his life as a grammarian, he might have wanted to use some negative words to show that it was bloody awful or something like that. Yeah. And also conflict. Although we had very few conflict discourse units, they did tend to have swear words in them. So if I'm going to come out fighting, I'm going to use fighting talk. So the macro structure will reflect the microstructure. The two are mutually supportive. And indeed, it's interesting in the literature because people have said that the nature of these interactions naturally lead to increased swearing, because they don't only convey strong emotion, but they also provoke more intense emotion. So some people have said that you might get this frequency effect, because if I start to have an argument with Eric and I'll say, what did you bloody well think you were doing? He might say, well, I was bloody well doing this, and he'll swear back. So you get that sort of amplification effect in that if I start to swear, you will start to swear. I'm conveying emotion, you will convey emotion. But remember, we're actually meeting the same functional goal. We are engaging in a macro structure of conflict. And within that, we have the license to express these emotions and draw upon these microstructures. But also the selection of the microstructures might be influenced negatively. So in advice, we were seeing the swear word shunned, with the fewest swear words per discourse type occurring there, along with description, future, figuring things out, past. And if we go right back to Grice in 1975, it was said that interlocutors assume the speaker is reliable in conveying truthful information, and work by people like DeFrank and Colbor have shown that when people swear, the perception of them is that they're being untrustworthy. So less swearing, more trustworthy. So if you're giving advice, a good strategy is not to swear because you appear more trustworthy. So we can make sense from the literature of what we're seeing in the results. Let me give you a couple of examples. Here's an example of where swearing by one person provokes swearing by the other. It's from a feeling discourse unit from the BNC. Like, everything's kind of just out of proportion with my body, but that's the kind of thing that when you look at me, you don't see my insecurities, but it's the same with me. I look at you and I don't see your insecurities because I don't know what the fuck you bang on about all the time, because I literally look at you and I'm just like, what the fuck are you talking about now? And I feel the same when you fucking say the same shit. That's what I mean, etc. So you can see swearing, licensed, swearing, repeat. Doesn't always work. Nice example in the paper that I'll cite to you later on, where somebody swears and somebody says, please don't swear. So you can actually get the interlocutor. Remember, people have agency here. They're not just the prisoners of language. They're using language. They can say, don't swear. They can resist this behavior. But very often what we're seeing is somebody doing that and somebody doing that. Conflict, I swear, you swear, etc. Here's another one. This is from a pass, and it's where somebody is associated with swearing, and therefore that builds to a negative evaluation of them. And as soon as he became well, he didn't become famous. He got on the BBC and he had his first music video, first single. Oh, right. And that's as soon as his video was finished recording. That's when he became cocky, like, I'm fucking better than you. You're a cunt, like, fuck off, sort of thing. So here they're talking about a person who swears. So it builds up to, I've heard stories like that about him as well. He's cocky. So it leads to the negative evaluation. That person is negative, untrustworthy, etc. They're associated with swearing. Negative evaluation then follows from the hearer. So we can see many of these patterns that people have hypothesized in the literature, reflected in the data. But also, as I've said, you can interestingly find autonomy on the behalf of hearers, who sometimes resist those patterns and say, I don't want to swear, or do not. But generally, you see the patterns working that way. So I've looked at macrostructures there and very briefly shown you how they can attract or shun swear words dependent upon their function. In the paper, we also take an inventory view and just look at narratives and see actually that the emotional subparts of narrative also do the same. So the parts of narrative associated more classically with emotion also seem to have more swear words in them. So it seems to be a general truism, whether you take this macrostructural view or just look at large individual macrostructures like the narrative itself. But you can read about that in the paper I'm going to reference in a moment. So the link between macrostructural function and emotion seems to be the key driver in attraction. If you're engaged in a macrostructure, the function of which is associated with emotion, you're likely to see more swear words in that macrostructure. And the macrostructure conveying descriptive information seems to be a key driver in repulsion. If you want to be viewed as trustworthy in conveying information, you avoid it, and therefore those functions actually get the reduced volume of swearing within it. And of course, some of these results have been found before. I was able to fit the literature to what we've seen in the data. So there was an interesting corroboration in that sense. But also I point out that we did find examples where individuals don't follow the patterning. And that's always something to remember in corpus linguistics. We work at a level of aggregation, but never forget the individual, because it's the individual who's using language. And some individuals may not follow those general patterns and may not follow those patterns with a particular discourse goal in mind. As I said, like the person who said, don't swear to me. They were saying something about their perceived values. One thing I'd say about a lot of work in discourse pragmatics is it's focused on microstructures. So I think has actually missed a lot of these links between things like macrostructures and swearing. And I think that's to its disadvantage. So if we're forever just looking at lexis, we'll miss out on some of these macrostructural features, which are important perhaps in talking about why lexis was chosen in specific contexts. Also, I find it strange that major works on discourse pragmatics ignore swearing, whereas for me, swearing is quite important in discourse pragmatics. As you've seen, it's an important way of conveying emotion that we've just seen there and controlling the flow of interaction and actually also distorting the flow of interaction towards certain microstructural features. So use swearing because I've just used it type of thing. But you know, when you look at major works on discourse pragmatics like that, they never mention swearing. Also, we should expect that discourse pragmatics and swearing will interact, as discourse is a resource which is A, drawn on by a number of discourse macrostructures and interaction. We've seen that it has an important life to play in at least 3 of our discourse macrostructures. It's subject to a degree of negotiation by participants in the conversation. I've given you those examples where you can see speaker A doing something, so speaker B follows, or on occasion, speaker B resists. So it's something that's important to that. And it's known to be used for specific effects in discourse in certain contexts, as researchers of swearing have shown, and is very easily shown if you look at contexts like conflict, for example. Also, at the microstructural level, swear words have been shown to function as discourse markers. Oh, shit, shit. That very frequent category of swear words, the general expletive of anger or annoyance, usually acts as some type of discourse marker, either giving feedback or actually signaling the start of some type of new interaction, putting a stop to that and starting something else. Oh shit, I've got to run now, that type of thing. Or you say something and I say, oh shit, it's some type of evaluation back to you. But it's largely ignored in the literature. I don't know why, I can imagine. The next stop for me is to look at American English. At the moment, I'm working with people at Northern Arizona, Paul, a team at Lancaster, Jesse, Doug, a team at Lizzie Hanks, a team at Northern Arizona. We're trying to build the same type of corpus that we have in the BNC 2014 for North America, USA. And we're doing quite well. And we hope maybe later this year to be announcing some data grants so that people can work on an early version of the corpus. So if you're interested in casual conversations in context in the US, this will be a very interesting corpus for you to look at. There have been very few corpora like it. I suppose the last one would be the Santa Barbara corpus. But when you look at Santa Barbara, it's actually very skewed towards the major urban centers in the US. Whereas at the very start, I said to Jesse that I was as interested in language in South Dakota as in Illinois. You know, I wanted it well spread out. We're doing as good a job as we can to make sure there are a broad range of speakers geographically, in terms of ethnicity and other demographic features, etc. So I'd like to do this type of work on American English as well to see if it's the same in American English. That'll be later in the year. So if you're interested in reading about the LANA corpus, as we call it, the Lancaster Northern Arizona corpus of spoken English, we've just published a paper talking about some of the things that we've done there. And actually that includes some comments on automated transcription of casual conversation, which might be of interest to those of you interested in AI aspects of the work. And also, if you're interested in the full version of this talk, which actually also includes the analysis of swearing in narrative, you can read that paper, which we published last year, or late last year, in the Journal of Pragmatics. Okay, I'm finished.